A 410-acre reservoir in central Texas has disappeared. Not evaporated, not siphoned for agriculture, drained in a matter of hours through a catastrophic failure in its own dam. As of the morning of May 14th, 2019, Lake Dunlap, a hub of recreation and real estate near New Braunfels, was mostly a deep, muddy canyon. Nearly 2 billion gallons of water had violently flushed downstream. Hundreds of boats were left dangling from their hoists, suspended 20 feet in the air above what was just yesterday a lake. The Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, the state agency that owns the dam, would later classify the event as a complete structural collapse. Security cameras captured the moment the reservoir began to vanish. On a calm, clear Tuesday morning at 7:49 a.m., the surface of Lake Dunlap is placid. Seconds later, a section of the 90-year-old dam buckles, folds in on itself, and unleashes a torrent of water moving at 11,000 cubic feet per second. But here's the detail that tells the true story. The people who lived on the lake, who woke up to the sound of rushing water, did not find a sinkhole at the bottom of the basin. They found the intact remnants of an antique piece of engineering lying flat on the riverbed. The strangest part of this story is not that a Texas lake vanished overnight. It is that the dam that held it was designed to fail this way, and that it was only the second domino in a chain of collapses that was just getting started. To understand what is happening on the Guadalupe River, you have to understand the technology that made the lakes possible. The 6 dams of the Guadalupe Valley Lakes system were built between 1928 and 1932. They are not towering concrete walls like the Hoover Dam. They are low-head hydroelectric dams, designed with a feature called a bear trap spillgate. Imagine a massive, shallow V-shape made of timber and steel, 85 feet long and 12 feet high, lying on the river floor. When the gate is raised, it holds back the river, creating a reservoir. When it is lowered flat, it allows floodwaters to pass over it unimpeded. The mechanism that held these gates upright was a series of heavy steel girders, and crucially, a set of structural steel tie bars. These bars, the hinges of the entire system, remained constantly submerged in the sediment and murky water of the Guadalupe River for nearly a century. They could not be properly inspected. They could not be easily replaced. Over 90 years, deep beneath the surface, the steel was slowly and visibly degrading. This is the part the headlines do not capture. The failure at Lake Dunlap was not an unforeseen accident. It was an inevitability, coded into the very structure of the dam from the moment it was built. And the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority, or GBRA, knew it. The warning shot had been fired 3 years earlier. On March 10, 2016, the spillgate at Lake Wood, another of the 6 sister lakes in Gonzales County, suffered an identical structural collapse. The lake dewatered overnight. At the time, the GBRA's general manager, Bill West, promised the community that the dam would be fixed within 6 months. He then retired, and the promise was left to his successors. The lake remained a dry riverbed. The agency, funded by a dwindling revenue stream from hydroelectric power that was no longer economically viable, could not afford the tens of millions of dollars required for a modern rebuild. They patched what they could. They monitored. And they waited. It's a bizarre piece of engineering from another era, holding back billions of gallons of water. Curious what you think about this kind of aging infrastructure still being in operation today. Then came the morning of May 14th, 2019. Under nothing more than the normal pressure of a full lake on a calm day, the corroded steel tie bars at Lake Dunlap's middle spillgate finally reached their breaking point. They snapped. With its primary support gone, the 12-foot-high wall of steel and wood folded, collapsed, and laid itself flat on the bottom of the river. The 1.92 billion gallons of water behind it had nowhere to go but out. The violent draining carved a new, deeper channel into the lake bed, and within 6 hours, the 410-acre reservoir was gone. The aftermath was surreal. Waterfront homes suddenly overlooked a barren, muddy chasm. Docks that once floated on the surface now stood on exposed stilts 30 feet high, and perhaps the most defining image of the crisis. Hundreds of expensive wakeboard boats and pontoons, which had been lifted out of the water the night before, on their automatic hoists, now hung eerily in the sky, a fleet of ghost ships suspended over a dry canyon. The disappearance of Lake Dunlap triggered an immediate economic and existential crisis. Property values along the now non-existent lake plummeted. The local economy, heavily reliant on summer tourism and recreation, faced devastation. Homeowners were in an uproar, demanding answers from the GBRA. The agency's new general manager, Kevin Pattison, was left to deliver the impossible news. In a series of tense public meetings, he explained that the dams were a ticking time bomb. The hydroelectric system, he stated, no longer generated enough revenue to fund the massive capital improvements needed. The cost to replace a single spillgate was estimated between $35 and $40 million. And with 4 more identical, 90-year-old bear trap gates still in operation on Lake McQueeney, Meadow Lake, Lake Placid, and Lake Gonzales, the risk of another potentially fatal collapse was not just possible. It was probable. That's what keeps us up at night, Pattison told the media, describing the terrifying scenario of a gate failing while swimmers or kayakers were near the dam. So on August 15, 2019, just 3 months after the Dunlap disaster, the GBRA made a decision that sent shockwaves through the entire Guadalupe Valley. They announced a plan to intentionally drain the 4 remaining lakes. Citing imminent public safety risks, the agency declared it had no other choice. To prevent an uncontrolled catastrophic failure like the one at Dunlap, they would preemptively lower the gates and dewater the rest of the system. The community's reaction was explosive. They saw it as the state abandoning its responsibility, destroying billions in property value, and erasing a way of life that had existed for generations. It was in this moment of crisis that a local homeowner named Jay Harmon, president of the newly formed Preserve Lake Dunlap Association, helped spearhead one of the most unusual civic rebellions in Texas history. If the state would not fix the dam, the citizens would. What they proposed was almost unheard of. They would campaign to form a special taxing district, vote to tax their own properties, and raise the $40 million themselves to rebuild the state's dam. Now, here is the part nobody on the national news was covering. The plan was a colossal gamble. It required convincing thousands of angry and financially stressed homeowners to voluntarily take on a massive new tax burden, for decades, to fix a piece of public infrastructure. The organization, led by Jay Harmon and others, launched a relentless campaign. They held town halls, went door to door, and argued that the only way to restore their property values and their community was to pay for the solution themselves. The alternative was a permanent mudflat. On November 3, 2020, the vote was held. The creation of the Lake Dunlap Water Control and Improvement District, or WCID, passed in a landslide. Residents had chosen to tax themselves to save their lake. It was an extraordinary decision, born of desperation and resolve. Douglas Harrison, president of the new WCID board, worked with the GBRA and the Texas Water Development Board to secure the legal framework and low-interest financing. The path was now clear. Construction on a new modern dam for Lake Dunlap officially began on May 14, 2021, exactly 2 years to the day after the collapse. It was a powerful community story of resilience and self-reliance. And if you find these kinds of deep dives into how people respond to crisis valuable, you can subscribe for more. This channel is dedicated to exploring the complex stories behind the headlines. Anyway, the decision to tax themselves was just the beginning of a long road. For 1,571 days, Lake Dunlap remained a dry, empty scar on the landscape. The community that fought to save it had to live alongside the ghost of their lake. During that time, an enormous cleanup effort took place. As the mud dried and cracked, a century of lost history was revealed. Sunken boats from decades past, rusted lawn chairs, antique bottles, and debris from the original 1930s construction emerged from the depths. It was a strange archaeological dig in the heart of their community. But as Lake Dunlap began its slow journey toward restoration, the clock was still ticking for the rest of the system. The very scenario Kevin Pattison had feared came to pass on August 3, 2021. During normal operations, the spillgate at Lake Gonzales catastrophically failed. It was the third domino to fall. The lake drained. Then, just 2 months later, on October 14, 2021, spillgate number 2 at Lake Placid gave way. A fourth lake was lost. The pattern of accelerating failure was undeniable. The entire Guadalupe Valley Lakes system, a cornerstone of the regional landscape and economy for a century, was systematically unraveling. The cause was always the same: 90-year-old submerged steel, impossible to inspect, finally surrendering to time and pressure. In response, the communities around Lake McQueeney and Lake Placid followed the playbook written by their neighbors at Lake Dunlap. They, too, voted to form WCIDs. They, too, voted to tax themselves to fund the multi-million-dollar replacement of their dams, the engineering solution for these rebuilds, overseen by GBRA's executive manager of engineering, Charles Hickman, was to replace the antiquated bear trap gates with modern hydraulically actuated steel crest gates. These new structures are far more reliable and allow for safer, more controlled water management. Finally, on August 31st, 2023, after 4 years, 3 months, and 17 days, the new gates at Lake Dunlap were raised. The process of refilling the lake began. By October, the water had returned, the boats were taken off their hoists, and the canyon was a lake once more. The community had accomplished the impossible. They had brought their lake back from the dead. But the victory came with a startling new precedent for the state of Texas. If critical, state-owned water infrastructure fails, the financial burden may fall not on the state, but on the local citizens who depend on it. Zoom out, and the disappearance of the Guadalupe Valley Lakes is part of a much larger, more troubling story unfolding across Texas. The state is losing its reservoirs, but not always through the violent, sudden collapse of a dam. A second, quieter crisis is underway, driven not by failing steel, but by a lack of rain and a blistering sun. This brings us to Medina Lake. Located northwest of San Antonio, Medina Lake is one of the state's largest and most historic reservoirs. Unlike the Guadalupe Lakes, its dam is structurally sound. But the lake is disappearing all the same. A crippling multi-year drought, intensified through 2025 and 2026, has starved the rivers that feed it. As of June 2026, Medina Lake sits at just 4% of its capacity. It is, for all practical purposes, gone. The landscape is one of vast, sun-baked mudflats dotted with the skeletal remains of trees that once stood on the shoreline. Boat ramps end 100 yards from the water's edge. The bustling lakeside economy has evaporated with the water. One problem you can fix with money and steel, the other is a force of nature that no tax district can vote to repeal. Low-key send this to a friend who lives in a drought-prone state, because this is happening everywhere. This tale of two disappearances. The explosive man-made failure at Lake Dunlap and the slow, agonizing climate-driven demise of Medina Lake reveals the twin threats facing Texas's water supply. The state's water infrastructure is aging into obsolescence. Recent geophysical surveys discovered that the massive 2.5-mile-long Livingston Dam, one of the most critical reservoirs in East Texas, is physically sinking, threatening another potential disaster. At the same time, the fundamental source of the water itself is becoming less reliable, and sometimes the two crises blur together. In October of 2025, residents of Leander, a suburb of Austin, woke up to find their local reservoir, Lake Lakewood, had been heavily drained seemingly overnight. Panic and confusion spread through the community, with many fearing another Dunlap-style collapse. The reality was more mundane, but no less jarring. The city had rapidly drained the lake for necessary dam maintenance. The event was a stark reminder of how quickly a familiar body of water can vanish, whether by accident, by nature, or by decree. The visual is the same. Water one day, mud the next. What the story of Lake Dunlap proves is that communities can, with incredible effort, fight back against infrastructural decay. The restoration of Dunlap and the ongoing reconstruction at Lake Placid and Lake McQueeney, slated for completion in 2026, are testaments to that. But the cost is staggering. The total bill for replacing the gates on just these few lakes will run into the hundreds of millions of dollars, paid for almost entirely by local property owners. This creates a deeply fractured system. What happens to the next town with a failing dam that doesn't have the property wealth of the Guadalupe Valley? Who pays to fix a dam in a rural, low-income county? The Dunlap model is a solution for the few, not a strategy for the state. At the same time, no amount of money can solve the problem at Medina Lake, or at the dozens of other Texas reservoirs currently sitting at historic lows. The Texas Water Development Board is exploring long-term strategies like desalination and aquifer storage, but these are decades-long, multi-billion-dollar projects. They will not save Medina Lake this summer. And so, Texas finds itself caught between the certainty of failing 20th century steel and the uncertainty of 21st century weather patterns. The old world is breaking down, and the new world is becoming hotter and drier for the homeowners on the Guadalupe River. The immediate crisis has been met with an extraordinary act of collective will. The announcement from the Lake Dunlap WCID on the eve of the refilling captured the emotion of their 4-year struggle. Sometime in the next few hours, all the gates will have been raised. This is what normal will look like going forward. But for the rest of Texas, the definition of normal is changing. Normal is a state where a lake can be here one day and gone the next. Normal is a summer where treasured reservoirs become desolate wastelands. Normal is the constant, underlying anxiety about whether the water you depend on will be there tomorrow. The saga of the disappearing lakes is not just about water or dams. It's about the visible decay of the systems we built to control our environment, and the growing power of that environment to overwhelm our control. 3 questions now hang over the state of Texas. First, with hundreds of aging dams still in operation, which community will be the next to face the impossible choice presented to the residents of Lake Dunlap? Second, as droughts become more frequent and severe, at what point do reservoirs like Medina Lake move from being in crisis to being permanently lost? And finally, what does it mean for the future of a state when its water can vanish in 2 equally terrifying ways? Violently,